Hey friends, welcome to part one of our local Ottawa series on being a community that cares. And so in this week, we were talking about what it means to be a community that cares for ourselves. We started the recording button just a little bit late, so I'm giving you a little bit of intro to give you context for the conversation that we're going to be having. So over this week and the next 3 weeks, we're looking at what it means to be a community that cares. And the reason we're having this conversation is that we're looking ahead to regathering in the fall as a local Ottawa community to start getting together a little bit. And there's things we don't know about that. We don't know we know that it's going to be happening, but we don't know the when, where, and how. There's things that are up in the air. For example, we've had feedback about the Lansdowne Theatre. And that's been a great space for us, but it also has its limitations, certainly in terms of accessibility, not the most accessible space, and its flexibility, both in terms of time, of how long and when we can gather, but also what we can do in that space. And so as I've been talking in home church tours and having communications with people in our Meeting House Ottawa community and our leadership team, our elders and our coordinators, just recognizing that there's certainly the sense that maybe this is a good opportunity, that if there's a space that would be better for us in terms of accessibility and flexibility, now might be the time to make a transition to that. And so we have a team that's looking into that, but we don't have anything finalized on that, and that's going to be kind of ongoing. And as we get news on that, we'll let you know, but you can be praying for us as we're looking at that space. And so things like that, we don't have it all figured out yet. We don't have all the details of how it's going to be working yet. But we do know that we are going to be gathering, and we do know the why and the who. We do know that we, as our community, Meeting House Ottawa community, is going to be getting together, and we know the why for that. We know that when we come together, it's to share and to experience the love of Jesus together. We share that love with each other, and we experience it together as a community, and we get together that way. And so I've been asking our community, who do we want to be 2 years from now? If you were to ask somebody 2 years from now to describe the Meeting House Ottawa, what would you want them to say? And so I've intentionally been asking our elders and our coordinators and key people in our community about that very question. Who do we want to be in 2 years? And I got all sorts of interesting responses. The primary one, is that we want to be a Jesus-centered community, but we also want to be inclusive and accessible. We want to be a community that experiments, that tries different things, where families can belong and kids and parents can learn together. We want to be a church that creatively tries new things, but we also really want to be a community that is deeply invested in our neighborhoods and caring for our neighbors and known in the community as a place where people can go for help, and that we are for our neighborhoods and Ottawa as a whole. And there's just so much good stuff, and the feedback I've gotten has been really describing a church that I am excited to be a part of, and I hope you are too. But when I boiled all that feedback down, I can really summarize it in that the heart of our Meeting House Ottawa community is to be a church that cares for each other and that cares for others. And so that's good, because at heart, Jesus says that his followers will be known for their love, for their care. That the identifying marker of what it means to be Jesus' follower is how much they care, how much they love. And that love, that phrase can be like a little bit nebulous. It can be, what does it mean to love somebody? But that's where 1 John 3:16 is really helpful, because it says that this is how we know what love is, that Jesus laid down his life for us. And so the kind of love we're talking about is not just sort of hypothetical feelings, of warm, fuzzy feelings for hypothetical people, but it's actual tangible care that costs us something for actual people that we rub up against in our everyday lives. And so it's got a little bit, it's got skin on it, it's got meaning to it, and that's the kind of love that we're going for. That's what it means to be a community that cares, is even when it costs us something, we stay invested. Even when it isn't easy, we continue to try and love well. And of course, all of this is motivated by something more. It's not just that we want to be better people. That's not why we care. We do it because God has loved us first. And so when we love others, we tap into an energy that goes beyond ourselves. We tap into sort of the way that the universe is supposed to work, that if God is love and God has loved us, then as we love others, we are in alignment with God and what God's heart for the world, how the world is created to be. And so we want to be a community that cares. And so that's what we're going to be doing over the course of these 3 weeks in June, talking about what it means to be a community that cares. And so next week, June 20th, we're going to have a few people, 5 people from our Ottawa community, do 5-minute mini TED Talks around the theme of what it means to be a church, a community that cares for others. And then on June 27th, I'm going to be doing some teaching, and we're also going to be doing some practices around what it means to be a community that cares for each other. How can we be a community that cares for one another? But we start the conversation in this teaching this week around the theme of what it means to be a community that cares for ourselves. Why do we start with ourselves? Well, we get into that a little bit in the conversation. And in order to help us have that conversation, I'm so happy that we were joined by a special guest, Kathy Bernard. She's our care pastor at our Oakville parish, and she's also a registered psychotherapist, and just a wonderful person to help us have this conversation about what it means to care for ourselves and why that's really important right now, and why that's really the necessary first step before we move on to caring for others and each other. Hope you enjoy this conversation, and I hope you're able to join us or rewatch on June 20th and June 27th as well.
Thank you. It is so good to be here. I have been a meeting houser for, actually it's now over 20 years. And so I'm like really excited because Ottawa has been on my to-do list. It's one of the locations I haven't yet been to. So although virtually, I'm still really excited to be here with you. Thanks, Eric.
I will say that the virtual commute is a little bit better than the actual commute.
So much better, isn't it?
From here to Oakville. So Kathy, in this series, we're talking about being a community that cares for ourselves, for each other, and for others. But we're starting by talking about caring for ourselves, which can seem probably a little bit counterintuitive because, Jesus teaches us to love our neighbor. And that's what we're supposed to be all about, is, loving others. So why would we start with this idea of caring for ourselves first?
Great. I love that question. And I actually get that question a lot in my practice, or I see it a lot in my practice. And my clients often see me doing this. And this is in reference to oxygen mask. Because we know, if anyone has ever traveled before, you get on a plane and the stewardess goes through their safety briefing. And in that safety briefing, they talk about, should we hit some turbulence and we lose cabin pressure, oxygen masks are going to fall from above your head. Please put it on yourself first, and then the children and those with disabilities that may be around you. And I have yet to hear anyone say, excuse me, that's very rude. Why would we put it on ourselves? We need to help those around us. We know it only makes sense that you have to make sure you've got the oxygen so that you can help others. You are no help to anyone if you are passed out on the floor. And the Bible actually is fairly clear about this as well. It does. It says, love your neighbor. How? As you love yourself. And I don't think Jesus was trying to say, treat them crappy, don't feed them well, all the things that we kind of do to ourselves. I really don't think that's what he was talking about. I think we are, so it's built in. You're supposed to be taking good care of yourself, modeling that to others, and then doing that for others when they're unable to do it for themselves.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think that's so important, right? Because I know I've been around church world my whole life, and I think there can be, and I think this isn't just church, but any space where the community gathers to care about others. I think about, you just see it so often where we can get so focused on caring for other people, and that comes at the expense of our personal health. Mm-hmm. And that comes at the expense of the well-being of our families and the people that we're close to, because we're always putting others first, but we're depleting ourselves in the process, and eventually that sort of like runs out, right?
That's true. And Jesus himself didn't do that. You see that he took the time away. He took time for himself. He took time to spend just him and his Father. Like, it was, Jesus even modeled it to us. So we've got lots of examples, so we can let ourselves off that guilt hook we tend to be on. Right.
And so that's why we're starting with this, being a community that cares for ourselves. And before just keep the conversation going with Kathy, I just wanted to say, if you have questions that come up for you as Kathy and I are having a conversation, if you want to drop them in the chat or even just message me directly through the chat, we'll try and save a little bit of space at the end for some question and answer with Kathy. So if you've got questions that come up, feel free to drop them in the chat, and we'd love to get to those. Okay, so if we need to take care of ourselves first, I think probably a helpful starting point would be if we check in on where we're at right now. I know I'm having a lot of conversations with people right now about how they're doing, and there's a sense of hopefulness, I think, about the future. We're in the very first weekend of reopening, and I think that has been helpful for people. But at the same time, there's this sense of people are just trying to hang on and kind of get to the end of this thing, whenever that is. And so there's some hopefulness, but I mean, I think even still, I talk to parents, for example, who are still feeling that loss of their kids not being able to go back to school, and sort of recognizing that once again, Easter through to, September, they're the only people who are watching their kids, and everything just feels heavy. So why don't you, but that's my observation. So in your practice and the work that you do, what are you seeing about where people are at right now, Kathy?
Well, I talk a lot about margins, and this has been very true even since from our first lockdown. So maybe I'll just walk through you with what I mean by when I talk about margins. Mm-hmm. So imagine you're sleeping, you're going to be at 0. You're peaceful, you're calm, everything is good. When we wake up, we're maybe around let's say 20, as far as, I wouldn't say straight, but like arousal, awareness, because we need to be. Otherwise, you fall down the stairs, you walk into traffic. We need a low-lying amount of stress and awareness in our lives. But when you're at a 50, if you go 50 and above, 50 is our flight and fight. So that's when we change from our prefrontal cortex, which is our thinking, rational brain. And this isn't a conscious thing that we do, but we go into our amygdala. And that is, I lovingly call her Amy. She takes over, the amygdala takes over, and it's not something we're consciously processing. It's that fight, flight, or freeze. But usually we've got like all of this margin between, you're sleeping peacefully. Sorry, I feel like Doug Ford on all his charts with my hands. I just saw myself. Anyway, you're sleeping peacefully, you're at a 0, you wake up and you're functioning right around here. And then here we go for this fight or flight. So you're functioning, you're trying to get out the door, kids can't find their shoes. It's aggravating, you kind of have a little bump when you come back down. Maybe you have to do a presentation and you're not big on public speaking. Oh, here we go, we go up. But we still stay in our prefrontal cortex this whole time. What's happening right now is we're waking up in this pandemic world, and we're waking up now probably around a 40. This has been a good, what are we at, 18 months. We don't have a lot of room. The kids can't find their shoes. Suddenly we're in this fight or flight. We're really having these higher emotions. We're being triggered up here, and then it's hard. We don't just naturally come down. It's a harder thing to come down below. So you're running late for something. Oh, now you've been triggered. You're up here, another thing happens, and it's just building. And people are saying to me, like, I don't know what's going on. I feel short-tempered, or they're seeing it. I saw it going to the grocery store a couple weeks ago. The guy at the deli was handing a bag to a customer, and the customer told him to F off. And this poor young kid at the deli was like, what is happening? And I had kind of a mini session with him, because I'm like, this isn't about you. This is, people are just in this different place. And to help understand that a bit, why our margins are reduced the way they are, in our first lockdown, regardless of how you felt, regardless if you're someone who maybe really does feel a lot of anxiety over COVID, or if you're someone who's like, oh, I'm not worried about that at all, that really doesn't play into when you go into the grocery store and we can no longer, everyone's masked, so you can no longer, facial cues are not there. Mm-hmm. Toilet paper's missing. There's like shelves without pasta and whatnot. That's telling your brain, this subconsciously telling you something's going on. I need to pay attention. And Amy goes, bing, okay, what's going on? She's on high alert. Um, it's taking up a lot of our processing that's going on in the background. And so then we start to have some trauma responses because we're aware something's going on. This is a scary experience. For myself, I know first lockdown, I was like, yes, sorry, I've got all these books I want to read, and I was so excited about it. And I read the same page 12 times, and I still to this day cannot tell you what that book was. Couldn't figure out what's going on. Then I realized, okay, I'm experiencing a traumatic response. And in the naming it, in the saying, okay, and being gentle on myself and not saying, I want to read, I need to read, I was like, nope, right now, I can't process that. Really helped for me to relieve some of that. This third lockdown, a lot of people have been saying to me, I don't know what it is about this lockdown. I'm really struggling. And again, understanding what's going on around us is important. So what happened? We had our premier came out. He said, I don't, we've just determined lockdowns aren't good. We're not going to have lockdowns. Again, regardless of how you feel about that, we were given some information and you kind of process it. Within a 48-hour period, they changed it and said, oh, guess what? No, actually, we're full lockdown. That's difficult. That kind of change is difficult for us to process. At the same time, our education minister came out and said, we know lockdowns aren't great for kids. We're not going to do that. And in less than 24 hours, did a turnaround. And I think this is what really caused a lot of difficulty for people. He unfortunately used this word. He said, indefinitely. And that is where a lot of people have started to not realizing it, but have started to struggle. When we had the lockdown, we said 2 weeks. Even if we hate it, we still got some control. We're like, okay, I can hold on for 2 weeks. And then they extended. Okay, well, I still don't like this, but I can hold on. When he gave us the word indefinitely, that's now taken away our control. How do you plan for indefinitely? How do you process indefinitely? And so the third lockdown, I think, was really, I found throughout my practice and friends and colleagues as well, really struggled. And in naming this, there was a bit of, oh, that makes a lot of sense. Okay. And then being able to find some other areas where you can control, things you can control to kind of help with that. But as we're dealing with all of these things, plus all of these losses, everything else that is going on, our margins really limited. We've just got this little bit of margin. I think that's what people are dealing with, and not necessarily understanding. And then they're like, why am I feeling snappier with my family than usual? Or, I don't have the same patience, or maybe I can't concentrate, or I'm not sleeping well, or all of these other things. And without that understanding of what's going on, we tend to actually make it worse because we don't know what's going on, and then that evokes another layer of concern. Does that make sense?
Yeah, no, totally. I mean, because I know I live in a house with 9 people, and I know, we've had that experience too, where it's like, oh, wait. And, I mean, even with just my immediate family too. I mean, it's like, oh, wait, this thing isn't a big thing. And yet it feels like it's become a big thing. And it's why? And it's like, oh, well, because, the margin is so small, right? It's right there. And, and I'm seeing that with my neighbors, my friends, and things like that. And so I guess one of the things I want to follow up on is you said, you mentioned all these losses that we've experienced. And in some ways, like the losses, that indefinitely, the loss of kids going to school, I mean, the loss of our vacations, all the things we've lost, the loss of lives, on top from the pandemic. And then of course, all the other things that are just happening in our world alongside that. I mean, we talked this morning at the beginning of the live stream about, what happened in London this week. And 2 weeks ago, it was the 215 kids in Kamloops, and it's just one thing after another. And I feel like in some ways it's happening so fast that we haven't had actually any time to process the losses and the grief that we've been experiencing. I mean, I know of people who weren't able to be there. They lost loved ones this year, and they weren't able to be there for the funeral. And we haven't had the same sort of grieving mechanisms that we've had before. And so what would you sort of say is what are some of the ways that, as maybe as we're getting towards the end of this, that we can begin to process some of the losses that we've had? Because I think, I've written about this, that when we just sort of start at, if we just want to skip over the grieving process and get right to, okay, well, that happened, let's move on, that's not, healing, that's sort of denial. So how can we avoid just living in denial and actually deal with what we've actually experienced and the losses that we've experienced, and do that well?
Well, one, I would say to people, go ahead and read Eric's blog. It was really good. It really did cover a lot of this. Um, and with grief, first, I think we need to grieve. We need to give ourselves permission to grieve. Sometimes we do. We just want to skip through the grief to, okay, let's be positive. Like, this is hard enough. Grief just sounds awful. And I have had recently a lot of people, well, I don't, what even is grief? Like, what does grief look like? We often think it's just sadness. Grief, I would say my personal definition is it's kind of all those emotions. Grief can include anger. Grief can include sadness. Grief can include all all the range of human emotions are kind of wrapped up in grief, and you can feel them all at different times. Um, Naming it is important. Like, it's a loss, and let's avoid comparing, because that seems to be what people, well, you know what, people have it worse than me, or um, let's not do that. If you're experiencing, for example, my daughter, 16, and she's one of those cannot wait to drive a car. Like, 16th birthday, she was there to write her test, and she was supposed to write her G2 so that she can drive on her own. And I cannot tell you how excited she was. And her test was scheduled on Thursday, and the province opened up on Friday. And we were holding on. The drive center had said to her, well, just wait. We know Mr. Ford's going to open maybe earlier. Maybe you'll still be able to do this. And she couldn't. And I was like, own this. This sucks. Like, I'm not going to say to her, people have lost their jobs. People have lost family. Like, there's bigger deals than this. No, this is a big deal for you. And frankly, for her, she screamed for a good couple minutes. Her brothers came in, were a little concerned. We're like, no, Kira's expressing how she's feeling. So naming it, it's valid. Mourning, especially for those, I lost a cousin back in December, and it's where it's like this extra loss, because normally my family would get together and we would grieve and then celebrate and talk about her life, and we didn't get to have any of that. So I think also there needs to be some intentionality as well, for certain things to mourn and grieve well. And some of them we may have to delay some of that until we can, and that's an okay thing to do. In our grief, if we, instead of stuffing is never a good idea. That doesn't lead to good things. Reaching out to family, friends, talking about it, sharing our experience. Maybe even reaching out and talking to a therapist. Therapists have therapists, pastors have therapists, or a spiritual, oh, I have one and now I can't think what, that's right, spiritual director. There's lots of different options, but talking about it, giving words and naming how you're feeling is really important, instead of well, it's okay, like, let's move on. No, let's be in the moment and allow us, the only way through it is through it, and that's to experience it.
Mm. That's good. Yeah, I do think that I think one of the things that we need to be thinking of as community, as we think about being a community that cares for ourselves, is that we will probably need to take moments and be intentional about creating spaces where we can actually, as we get together, to actually sort of maybe mark and remember and process these things together. I think that's going to be an important part of that. Is if we just jump into, okay, well, that's over and we're on to the next thing, I think we're just going to carry a lot with us.
I agree. Yeah.
Dealt with. And so I guess, but at the same time as we do that, that's hard work. I mean, we've been through a lot. That's heavy. That's really heavy. I mean, yes, we have therapists and whatever, but I think, what are some of the things that we need in order to care for ourselves well as we're doing this hard work, because that takes a toll. It takes a toll on us. And so what would you say are some, self-care is a term that gets thrown around a lot. And it's something that we've talked a lot about this year. Slowing down, resting, those sorts of things. Abby even mentioned that in worship today, in musical worship, that idea of slowing down being an important lesson that we need to learn. But how do we do that well? How do we self-care well? How do we slow down and rest well? Because I know sometimes for me, if I'm honest, some of the things that I label self-care for me are really more coping mechanisms, sometimes unhealthy coping mechanisms that I'm just like, well, but I can give myself permission to do this because I'm too overwhelmed right now. So what makes for healthy self-care? And maybe what are some simple self-care practices that we can practice ourselves?
Sure. So I was thinking earlier about this. I think I might have a strange self-care. When I think self-care, I think boundaries and intentionality. That's what I'm going to say about self-care. We need to be intentional. It's not something that's just, oh, and a bath is a good thing. A bath actually releases positive hormones for us. So it's not that, taking a bubble bath isn't self-care, but we need to be very intentional about unplugging and setting good and healthy boundaries. Because even as you were saying that, I'm really feeling the overwhelm. Okay. Sometimes that's because we still have too much on our plate and we haven't set good and healthy boundaries. We may be doing good things, but we really need to remember our margins. Our margins are reduced. We're all living with this. As Erica said, C plus effort in a pandemic is worth the A plus effort. We need to be aware. Sometimes it can even, I hate to say, be a pride issue. Like, no, I can still just push through. Really paying attention to setting good and healthy boundaries for ourselves and being intentional. So in that, it can look like a lot of things. The top things I would recommend, and these, again, you can find them in scripture, meditation. Meditation and medication actually can have the same results. So often in my practice, if you need medication to get things balanced, great. But a place where I'll often start is with meditation. And we've talked about it in some of our teachings before. There's some great apps out there, Headspace. It might sound like I'm saying an easy thing. Oh, meditation, big deal. I struggle like nobody's business to set aside even 10 minutes in the beginning of my day to be quiet, to be still, to be intentional with this. So it's not that this is an easy thing, but getting outside. Something that I almost across the board suggest to people is journaling right before bed. Find a journal. So for mine, it's got a really soft, leathery, buttery texture. So I love to touch it. It's in my favorite color. So just as soon as I bring it out, it makes me happy just with that. And I write down 3 things from my day that I am thankful for, grateful for, that I enjoyed. Some days are a little bit trickier than others. And so I have to write, my socks were fuzzy. And it felt good. Like that might be the only thing that I am able to really pull out of my day. And that's okay. Because what I have found, again, I'm someone who I don't recommend it unless I am practicing it. I am a practice what you preach kind of person. What my family has now said to me, if something's going on, because the other day, the kids, I've got teenagers, they were interacting in the most hilarious and loving way and I was like, this is a little abnormal. And I leaned against the kitchen wall and I just stood and watched and enjoyed. And they're like, you're putting this in your journal tonight, aren't you, Mom? And I'm like, yes, I am. And so that paying attention at the end of the day actually then starts to retrain the way that we think throughout our day. It helps us to look for those positive things and changes that mindset. Instead of always being aware of the negative things, it starts to change what we're looking for. There's also different practices you can do to release oxytocin. So this is what's tricky in my practice. All the things that I would recommend as a psychotherapist to do, we can't do. So it's no wonder we're all struggling. Like socializing is a big thing. If you're struggling, I would, plan a date night with your friends. It's not something we can do. Physical touch is really big. Again, depending on what your bubble is, it's a little bit tricky. But helping others is something that actually releases oxytocin. So maybe there's like just a small little act of service you can do for somebody else. Endorphins are released when we exercise, when we laugh, when we listen to music. Serotonin, is a mood stabilizer, and that is released when we get sun exposure. So get outside. It's released when we practice mindfulness, when we go on nature walks. Dopamine, again, a very positive mood enhancer. Eating some good, healthy food is going to do that for you. One of the things, there was an article that went around talking about languishing. I would recommend to read it. It really helps understand what some people are experiencing right now as well. And one of the things to help with that is to set a goal and to achieve it. Just a small goal. It could be, I don't know, a drawer that just needs to be cleaned out. Set a goal and accomplish it. And by achieving that goal, you're releasing some dopamine. This is taking good care of yourself, making sure you get enough sleep. And again, having a bath falls in the dopamine category. So there are some things that sometimes are the cheesy, well, we have kind of stereotypically become cheesy, but that are still good for us if we are intentional about it. If it's an escape thing, we might need to look at that. If it's I'm going to set this time aside to have some quiet time, to kind of recharge my batteries. We don't let our phones, most people, when their phone is showing red, they don't keep pushing it, yet we run on our red battery. Actually, that's something I just recommended to a couple of my clients. I was like, I want you to print out a picture of our battery low charge and put it on your computer screen. So next time you're tempted to work on your weekend when you're not supposed to be, maybe put that on and ask yourself, where's your battery? Have you actually recharged your battery before you jump into all of these other things?
So good. And yeah, I mean, I know for me personally, probably the most helpful thing I've done in this pandemic is I was always walking my dog before, but now I'm walking my dog more. And, and I'll put in my headphones, I'll listen to some music, or, I'll go on a nature walk and do it quietly. But yeah, it hits so many other things, a little bit of exercise, a little bit of sun, a little bit of music, fresh air. And yeah, it's like, I did not think about the science of it, but it works for all those reasons. So that's amazing. So last question before, I think there's a couple for Q&A, I think, but last question I have for you is, I just want us to think a little bit. Yes, Aaron and Jeff, lots of Taylor Swift. Taylor Swift was a big help. As we're thinking about, as we're in this sort of in-between space, reopening just started this weekend, we can see a path forward with vaccines and things that we could be into a new normal, into, probably in the fall, as we're talking about, regathering as the meeting house and things like that. There's hope and excitement around that, but I think also for some people, including myself, there can be, some anxiety and fear around the idea of that. It can feel a little bit scary. It can feel a little bit overwhelming. So can you help us maybe set some expectations for ourselves as we enter into a new normal? And, about what to expect for ourselves and how can we manage that reintegration in a way that's not going to overwhelm us and, cause undue anxiety and stress.
And some of that, I love it because people that are extroverts are like, what are you even talking about? Let me go.
They're like, yeah, let's go, like, patio right now.
Just open the gates and let me through. And that's great. But even for our extrovert friends, I think if we think back to the beginning of the pandemic, when Zoom was very new to most of us, and Zoom fatigue, do you remember what a big thing that was? We all talked about it. I think if we're honest now, if I've spent a day on Zoom, it's not my favorite. And yes, I'm tired, but I am not tired in the way that I was March of last year. Our brains are incredible. They can learn and adapt. And we have actually, this right now is our new normal, this kind of interaction. So when we go back to person to person interacting, it's actually, we're gonna need some time to adjust. And I don't say that as a negative thing. I say that as a be aware. We're going to feel tired. It's going to feel overwhelming. If we know why we feel that way, then we can walk away and be like, oh, okay, I'm building these muscles back up. And so I'm saying this so that we know we're building up a muscle instead of what's wrong with me? I can no longer socialize. I can't do this. And then we spiral into a whole different situation. So that's not what's happening. It's not that you've lost your abilities to socialize, to interact. It's that muscle hasn't had to be used for a while, and we're going to build it up. And like anything else, it takes some effort to do. Also being aware, we are intelligent. We've been here before. I think there's maybe a little bit of hesitation in, we've kind of opened up, we've been told one thing, and then the world came. So there is going to be that hesitancy as well, right? Mm-hmm. Do we trust this? Is this going to work? Or, how engaged do I really want to be? And that's okay. That's human nature, but that's like the smart part of us going, fool me once kind of situation. So being aware, that's what we're facing. And it just because we opened up doesn't mean suddenly our margins do. We're still using up so much space with reprocessing what it is to have more people around us, what it is to commute, what it is to do all these other things, holding space for some kindness, some gentleness, and honestly, that self-care. Like if we try just to fill our calendars right back up, we will burn out so fast. So as tempting as it will be, we don't decide to run a marathon on the weekend and not train. This is going to be the same thing. We need some time to build back up these skills, and that's okay. And some people might take longer. And I think that was another part to be aware of, even with margins. Like you said, you live with 9 people. All 9 of you are experiencing a trauma at the same time. Like that's the other really difficult thing is normally if you experience a trauma, the people around you can still support in a very effective way. Whereas right now, no one really has margin. We're all kind of in this little space. So to be aware that other people, it's not to take things personally. Especially if you're introverted, you've been living your best life. Like, this is perfect. No one's asking me to do a bunch of stuff that I don't really like to do. They're going to be experiencing some heightened anxiety, and to just be kind and leave space to let people adjust at their own, and to be aware that it's not personal, that it's people just adjusting that way.
That's good. I always think back to Brene Brown talking about how it makes such a big difference if you can shift your mindset to the belief that other people are doing the best that they can.
Yeah.
That just that thought process is linked directly to like your own well-being. Is if you can get yourself to believe that other people are actually doing the best that they can. I think that's what we're going to have to do. I mean, I think it's what we've had to do through this point, and then also going forward. This is just like we need to be able to do that, and that ties into there's 1 or 2 Q&A questions which we'll try and get to quickly because we don't want to go too long for people. But can you talk a little bit about interacting with people in our lives, like family members or other close relationships who have or have had different approaches to the pandemic response, both past and future? So things like masking, vaccines, kids at school, but yeah, so people that we would, who would be approaching all of this different than us. And that's going to be, I think, even a bigger thing as regathering and reopening begins to happen, is people are going to feel safe with very different things. And the rules may not be quite as clear, the social rules might not be quite as clear going forward either.
Mm-hmm. And I think that plays into boundaries. And I used to teach a boundaries class, so that's always forefront of my mind, and it fits in almost every situation. So with boundaries, we have to remember what we're responsible for. So you are responsible. I think when I say boundaries, I often describe it as like your backyard with a fence around it. You're responsible for what's in your yard. You wouldn't hop over the fence and cut down your neighbor's tree and plant flowers you think would look there. We know that's just not what you do. You're responsible for what's in your yard. So moving forward, you're responsible to do what you do your research, you do what you think is the right thing to do for your family, and you don't owe an explanation. Um, you don't need to engage and convince other people to, because they're responsible for them. And if we can, instead of always having to land in black and white, if we can give space for other people, may have really high comfort zones, and that's okay. And other people may have very low comfort zones, and guess what? That's okay. You just need to be responsible for you. You're not responsible to convince everybody else. And if we can hold that in a loving way, it's because I've not seen one Facebook argument that's ever changed someone else's mind. So we invest all of this energy and we really feel like, oh, we figured this out. It's really not how it works. So be responsible, make good decisions, do your research, know what you hold, and you don't need to explain it to anyone. You're responsible for you, and they can be responsible for them. I mean, that's very simplistic. I realize there's people like you and I, Eric, who are thinking of our opening plans, and we are kind of responsible for everyone. But when it comes down to the worrying about the way people are behaving in a line at the grocery store, where you do you, and that's kind of going to be your best bet, because you cannot. What can you control? You can control you and your behaviors, and that's what you're responsible for.
Yeah, and that's an easier said than done thing, but I think
very much so.
very, very true. Last question, and this is just almost a clarification. So, wondering if you can articulate a little bit the difference between a grief response, a stress response, and a trauma response.
Sure. And I would say right now, that's a very good question. Thank you. We may be experiencing all of those at the same time, so there might not actually be clear lines. Like when my cousin died, I was still experiencing trauma response, and I was having grief response, and I was asked to do the funeral, and I do not enjoy any kind of public speaking, so I also had a stress response. So it was all of the above. Grief would be linked to loss, I would say, and that can be any kind of loss. It doesn't. My daughter experienced grief over her driver's test. I experienced grief over the loss of my cousin who died super young. The trauma response, and there's a lot of overlapping things. I guess I'd say this as well. A stress response. So when we say stress response, I think we were talking about when we go into our amygdala. That response, those things we're not even necessarily controlling them. So, you walk out, you go up north to the cottage, you walk out, there's a bear in the backyard. You're not going to think, oh, there's a bear, what should I do? You'll find yourself jump back in the house, slam the door, put on 6 locks, and you're breathing heavy before you've even really processed it. That's the amygdala response I was talking to, the fight, flight. Or you may find you've stood there frozen looking at it. It can be any of those fight, flight, or freeze responses. Grief is the emotions, and trauma, I think, would be better defined as more physical. Well, not even physical. Not being able to read well or concentrate is not necessarily physical, but the trauma responses are things like headaches, not being able to concentrate, not being able to sleep, loss of appetite. Like more of a physical response is your trauma response. Grief is more your emotions. Sorry, I'm a verbal processor, so I just verbally processed that answer aloud. I hope you were able to track with me.
That's so good. Well, Kathy, this has been really helpful as we think about what it means to be a community that cares for ourselves, and that being the sort of starting place is we want to be able to love our neighbor, but we want to be able to love our neighbor as ourselves, which means caring for ourselves. And so your advice here and your thoughts on this have been really, really helpful. And so just to close, I just want to read a prayer from Nadia Bowles-Weber that she put out a couple weeks ago. as where she is in the States, they're starting to reopen, and I think this applies to us as well. So let me just read it as kind of a closing benediction. Dear God, who made us all, a year ago we did not know that we were about to learn, that we could lose and somehow live anyway, where we would find comfort and where it would elude us, whose lives matter to whom, why we have kitchens in our homes. In mid-March 2020, all I knew for sure is that hoarding toilet paper doesn't make you safe, it just makes you selfish. But God, it feels like the world is about to open back up. And I'm both thrilled and kind of scared about that, because I'm not who I was a year ago. I want so badly to hug my friends again, and to laugh again, and have amazing conversations again. And yet, I'm not sure how long I could do any of those before crying or just getting really quiet. My emotional protective gear has worn so thin, and grief just leaks out everywhere now. I am so afraid that I will never be who I once was, and I'm also afraid that I will be. Not to mention, I'm not entirely clear what size jeans I wear as the me I am now. And yet, when I quiet my anxious thoughts, I start to suspect that I am now closer to the me you have always known and always loved. So help me to trust that, Lord. As things change, help us be gentle with ourselves and with each other. We are all wearing newborn skin right now. Amen. Well, thank you, friends, for hanging out with us and being a part of this conversation. Thank you, Kathy. And we will be back next week, same time, same place, as we hear from some friends in our Ottawa community about what it means to be a community that cares for others.